Good morning, everybody. Again, sincere apologies for the fact that one, I wasn't there on the original day for the session, and two, there seems to have been a bit of a confusion around the catch-up day. So I'm now going to record the session and I'm going to send it out and upload it to you all, so you've got a chance to have a look at it before we meet next week. So here we go. So welcome to SPS304. So term 3, mental health, or year 3, I should actually say. Now there's going to be quite a few things that you're going to be able to learn throughout the next 12 weeks. And by the end of that 12 weeks, you'll be able to demonstrate your knowledge on mental health in the community and how that mental health practice works within Australia society. Now, some of the things which are really important here is the fact that you will be able to critically analyse some of the issues associated with mental health and vulnerable members of the community. And also, like everything else that we do, we have to make ethical considerations, and we'll spend some time looking at that as well. And then we're going to assess the impacts on mental health issues on different community groups and demonstrate an understanding of the practice of mental health community work. So a lot of things that we're going to be covering. Now, really important is the prescribed text. So with this textbook, every single week there will be things on our PowerPoint presentations that will relate back to this prescribed text. So because this is your prescribed text, whenever you do an assessment, you will be expected to have this particular text in your reference list, as well as referring to it in your in-text referencing as well. Now, this textbook is available in the library at Stotts College, and it's also available to you on ProQuest. So please access that. All the work which I've done throughout this particular unit relates back to that. So it's in your interest to follow that book. So let's have a look at what mental health is. And I've embedded a couple of short videos throughout the session, so you'll be able to get an idea of mental health, but through other perspectives rather than just listening to my voice.
Mental health. What is it? Mental health is our ability to respond to the challenges that life throws at us. We can have all sorts of mental struggles about money, work, relationships, family, health, or just life in general. Good mental health is our ability to function, to bounce back from these struggles, and to be able to move forward. Being able to deal with the worries of everyday life helps us build resilience, which is another way of saying good mental health. Resilience can help us when our problems seem overwhelming. Without it, our mental health could spiral out of control, changing the way we feel, think, and behave. It could mean being worried or afraid all of the time, feeling numb or like nothing matters, or losing touch with what is real. When this happens, it can take some time to get back on track. At these times, it's important to reach out for help, whether it's through friends, family, or mental health professionals. Finding the right support can help us get back to feeling ourselves. Sometimes, though, professional advice is needed. But where do you find that? Head to Health can be a guide to help you find the right information, support, and advice from trusted service providers. Head to Health. We're here to help.
So just a little video just to sort of add in a few sort of things which, or reinforce some of the things which I'm saying. And I guess at the end of the day, when it comes to mental health issues, the one thing that we're always going to be encouraging people to do is reach out. And from our perspective as workers within the community, then we need to be able to know how to recognize certain mental health issues and how to refer people in the right direction. And so throughout the next 12 weeks, those are the things that we're going to be looking at. You know, what is mental health? What are the differences? How do we categorize it? Where does it all sit? And today is the beginning of starting to understand that. And making sense of mental health disorders does require some philosophical considerations. And the areas that we're going to look at is the mind and the interconnectedness between the mind and the body. Because at the end of the day, mental health comes in a variety of different issues. And we'll also be looking at coexisting needs throughout the next 12 weeks as well. So how does mental health issues that come from our mind impact us on or through the body? And how does that potentially, how are we going to be able to recognize that as we go? Some of the other things that we're going to be looking at is the social structure, because that is also going to impact an individual with their own mental health issues, what they think, how they're dealt with. There's also going to be some cultural areas which we will uncover and start to really look at. You know, what stops somebody from reaching out to get support versus other people that feel comfortable to be able to reach out and get some support. And then we're going to also try to make sense of an experience of a mental disorder from within our own mind, so as we can get a better idea of what it would be like for the people that we're working with and what it is that they're going through. So to be able to do this, we have to be able to start to look back at a little bit of the history around mental health. And this is something which can be very interesting. I believe it's very interesting, and I really want to share this with you so you can get a really good idea of how far we've actually come with our understanding of mental health issues. So way back when in ancient Greece, mental disturbances, they believed it was an outcome of brain disease and therefore can be treated by physicians. And no disrespects here, but way back then in ancient Greece, they actually had a really good idea and they were very clear about that. But then we come across to Western Europe and further towards modern times, the legacy that was left from the Middle Ages was that anybody with mental health issues could be either possessed by the devil or were dabbling in witchcraft. So in a way, you can actually say that the ancient Greeks were way ahead of Western European beliefs and thinking. And then we come along to what we call the Enlightenment age. And this is sort of referred to the centuries where there was a privilege to the reasons as a way of approaching and understanding the world and the world around the whole mental health issues. And this in time brought about a change of view that affected a way in which those that were seen as mad were actually treated as potentially having a mental health issue or an illness, rather than being classified as being possessed by the devil or dabbling in witchcraft. There was also noted that during that Enlightenment time that the thinking had been the attainment of rationality, which was a desire to gather and order knowledge. So rather than just come up with some simple idea around not understanding what was taking place, there was the beginnings of reality of this isn't right. What can we do about it? Where is it coming from? And what does it actually look like? So it became more sort of a medical issue. And then people started to look at this, and then you've got Linnaeus and Sydenham, who worked on the medical classifications and systems, which we then knew as what we call nosologies. So nosologies is a word that you will hear throughout definitely throughout this session, and again in some of the other sessions. So let's have a look at what does that actually mean. So you've got the German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, and he did a lot of work around nosologies, and what that basically required was looking at people with a mental health issue and understanding that not every mental health issue was the same. So he started the sorting, the grouping, the dividing, and the classifying of different mental health issues as were seen and understood by psychiatrists. So Kraepelin did a lot of work around this, and he then helped to generate these categories to make distinctions based around the characteristics that he then put into groups with very clear descriptions of what he believed each group had in common. So he did a lot of work. That was the beginning of where we moved forward with this, which led us into what we called the positivism age. So in the 20th century, we had the emergence of theories of knowledge. And this was categorized by an increased valuing of the personal knowledge and experience, and a recognition of the person as fundamentally being self-interpreting. So realistically here, what it is we're looking at people with potentially a mental health issue, and we're not just looking and observing from the outside, we're involving those people, we're talking to them about it, we're trying to get an idea, the bigger picture of what is actually taking place for them. And this view then endorsed multiple different views, each with their own validity, which then added into the characteristics of the postmodern philosophies. So we're building a picture here of where we come from historically to where we come up to modern day, which obviously in this presentation we haven't got to yet, but how we got there. So when Kraepelin was doing all of this work, this is what we were classing then as modern psychiatry, which was the development of a system of diagnostic categories describing psychopathology. And this in itself and in its entirety became indispensable. It moved towards the trend of classification, which had great benefits, but it also led to a reduction of the person to a description of his or her disorder, for example, schizophrenics. So what we're trying to look at here is the reality is to get an understanding of an issue, and to be able to help and support somebody with an issue, we have to understand what it is that we're working with. So that understanding then gets narrowed down into categories. So by categorizing something, on one hand it means that we're getting all of this knowledge and we're getting all of this understanding, and we're narrowing down things so we can work exclusively in a particular area. But by doing so, what we're also doing is reducing somebody from being a human being with an issue to a human being with a label, where, for example, anybody with schizophrenia is classed as a schizophrenic, and they kind of like they possibly can lose their identity through being labeled. So this is something that we moved on with very, very quickly. There's going to be some names here. So for example, Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was the founder of psychoanalysis. Now, for you to be doing this particular unit, it means that you've already had quite a journey through your bachelor degree, where you would have done all of your counselling units, you would have done your alcohol and other drug units, you would have gone through your case management units. Sigmund Freud's name should not be unknown to you at this stage. And knowing that Sigmund Freud's work predominantly come from psychoanalysis, we need to be able to be quite respectful around that, but at the same time we also need to give an understanding to how he did or how he gained his knowledge, who was he using to be able to demonstrate what psychoanalysis was from. And this is something that we're going to have a bit of a look at in the next couple of slides, because you can guarantee in today's world some of the work that these people did in our world today would actually be classed as being very, very unethical. However, we can only be respectful to the fact that they have done this work to get us to the knowledge that we do have now. So a couple of names which predominantly might not be quite as knowledgeable to you. You've got Ivan Pavlov, which was responsible for like conditioned reflexes and operant conditioning, which goes straight into Skinner's, where he provided the core framework of behaviorism. So what we're looking at here is cause and effect. Behavior, where does the behavior come from? We can't behave in a particular way without having a cognitive reaction, because the two come together, which is where your reflexes and your operant conditioning come into, and working with behaviorism. And all of this kind of ties into Freud's psychoanalysis as well. To give a better overview of this, and if I don't explain this very well because it's on this recorded view, please feel free to bring this to next week's session, and I'll elaborate on this a little bit more. But whilst we're talking about sort of ethical issues and what is right, what is wrong in the way that we deal with things, we cannot go past that to have the knowledge and understanding of what we have today. There have been a lot of research and a lot of experiments that have taken place. And this particular experiment, which I'm going to talk to you about now, took place in the 60s and 70s. Now, this was what was categorized as an ethnographical research. Now, when we talk about ethnographical research, what that actually means is the researchers actually took part in the research. So there was one particular research that took place in the 60s and 70s that involved students and prison officers. And one of the experiments was where they put all the students from a psychology class into being the prison officers, and they put all the prison officers into the role of prisoners, and they observed the behavior over a period of time to see what the impact was of giving somebody a title and a role, and would that title or role impact an individual's behavior. So over a period of time, the observation was that the psychology students, who were now classified as prison officers, actually started to behave as a prison officer. And the prison officers, who were now playing the role of a prisoner, they actually started to retract from being like their social role to actually acting like a prisoner. And there was a fear from the now prisoner to the now prison officer. So this particular research that I'm talking about now actually caused quite a stir back in the 60s and 70s, and was probably one of the main things that brought in ethical issues that we now have to address for any research that we do, because there were a lot of people that were psychologically damaged through some of these experiments. So for example, after this particular experiment, and that experiment was stopped, by the way, it didn't go for the full time, purely and solely because the reaction of both individuals from both sides of this experiment, their behavior became completely out of control and out of character. So they actually proved the point of what they were trying to make, that if you give somebody a title and you give somebody a power, then regardless of their character, there is a huge chance that they may fulfill the power given to them in a particular role. Even as I'm saying all of this out loud, I'm thinking, I wonder if the enormity of the message that I'm trying to give you is coming across, and I am actually doubting whether I have done a very good job of explaining that. So please, next week in the session, if I haven't done a very good job, please come and talk to me about the prison research model, and I'm happy to re-explain it. So looking at the sociology of mental health and illness, through all of this sort of experimental stage, there became an emphasis on how to place an understanding of the condition of every individual's mental illness. However, there was an awful lot of emphasis on females. So we're kind of move into a little bit more of a slightly different thought pattern here, and I can actually link this back to Sigmund Freud. So anybody here that has been in any of my classes where we have talked about Sigmund Freud, you'll already be aware that my understanding of the way that Freud does a lot of his work, or did a lot of his work, he used a lot of females, and Freud was very, very vocal about the fact that females were very much not equal to males, and that was, in all fairness, the thought back in that time. But it stayed, and the reasons behind this were the fact that women were predominantly going to suffer more from a mental illness than a male, purely and solely because they were inferior to men. And the reasons behind that were because they were biologically based to have that mental pathology, because their reproductive and their hormonal processes impacted them. So excuse me for smiling when I say this out loud, because we all know nowadays that, yeah, if you said that to any woman nowadays, they'd be a little bit like shocked. However, menstruation, childbirth, menopause historically was very well known to create vulnerabilities in females that could then lead to mental illness. So the women's movement, so we're coming back up now to sort of the 1950s, 1960s, and the women's movement was very much an argument to say that a woman's mental distress had nothing to do with their bodily makeup. It was to do with the fact that over the centuries that males had always seen them as inferior. So they lived under huge social and political constraints, and they lived under an oppressive condition of what we call patriarchy. So a female to date in the 1950s, right up to the 60s, and even sometimes the 70s, when a female got married, they came under the care of their husband, and they gave up work, they had the children, and that was their role in life. If they didn't get married and they didn't have children, they were always under the care of their father. So women never really had that opportunity to really progress through. However, during the Second World War predominantly, when all of the males had to go and fight, there was nobody to keep industry rolling. And of course, the Second World War had a span over about a 5-year period, and if there's no males to do the work, or very limited males to do the work, then women did the work. And so through doing that work, there was suddenly very slow start to the recognition that women were not as weak as what initially they were thought to be. And from there, things started to take a change. So the devaluing and the disempowerment of women, which has completely been reflected in history, started to get an understanding to be present in tendencies to diagnose women as mentally ill more than men, in higher rates of depression prevalent among the women. The feminist perspectives propose that women's madness might be better understood as a manifestation of emotional frustration, narrowness and confinement in their lives, because during that wartime, women blossomed. They had a freedom which they'd never had at all in the history. However, when the war ended and all the men that were left that did come back, the men expected the women to then take that step back, let them pick up all the work, and the women go back to being the humble housewife. And women suddenly realized that they actually didn't have to take that role. And this is predominantly when things really majorly started to take a change. And the 21st century movement increased the demands were made both of services and communities to respect the lived experience of people labelled with mental illness. So we've gone back to this labelled topic again here, and I want to elaborate a little bit on that, and I'm going to do that in a minute, because we're going to move on from like the feminist movement, and I need to cover that off first. So feminism revolutionized service provision, and in response to consumer advocacy and participation, the language that we used by medical doctors was really criticized. So for example, where we were calling mentally ill people clients, in Australia, they wanted to be known as consumers or survivors. Again, still a label, but that was the choice. So if we look at this and you think people with lived experience, you know that I think I've probably shared with a lot of you already that I've done a lot of work with Lifeline Australia. And one of the projects that I worked on in 2019-2020 was about developing a framework for their telehealth counsellors to be able to use. And to make sure that we got that service correct, we interviewed a lot of people that had used the service and lived through their experience of suicide attempt. And so that's a classic example of lived experience. People that had lived with suicide ideation, where they thought about taking their own lives on a regular basis, had even attempted to take their own life. This is something that, or the reality of this is, or the information around the reality of this is invaluable when it comes to developing a framework for telehealth counsellors to be able to work to support people that have those kind of needs. What better way to get that information from talking to the people that are likely to use the service? So we spent a lot of time researching, and we spent a lot of time reaching out and talking to these people to get an idea of what they wanted, what they needed. And through understanding their lived experience, we then went ahead and developed a framework for telehealth and then. And when we rolled the new framework out, we actually had the people that we'd worked with that had that lived experience, where we got their impact and their knowledge of what they needed. We had them with us at the time because it was a big national rollout, and it was really good, and it had a really positive impact on all the people that were going to use the framework, to know that this framework had been put together to serve the people that needed it, and it had been put together knowing that that is exactly what they said that they needed in place. Again, if that doesn't come across as being very clear, because this is a recording, bring it to the session next week, and I'm happy to recap on that as well. So then we're moving forward a little bit more into the 21st century movement here, and we had a lot of neuroscientific research which required us to think much more broadly. So again, looking a bit further outside of the box about how we are to understand the environment and the role which it plays in influencing consciousness and behaviour. We cannot move further here if we think about where all of this is Australian-based information. Australia is a multicultural country, and globalisation and climate change has also influenced physical, social, political and ecological characters of the world that we live in, specifically in regards to Australia. Now, if we were all in class, you would actually hear me say, hey, none of us are from Australia. We were all born from a different country, and we have all come to Australia for whatever reasons. Our life journeys has brought us to this country. So when it's looking at globalization, every single one of us has migrated here under whatever circumstances. And due to that, we bring with us our own life experiences, we bring our own languages, and we bring part of our own cultures. Now, if we have chosen to come here, the majority of the time there's been an element of research into what we are moving into, and we have a fairly clear idea of, or a fairly clear idea, to be honest, of the culture that we're moving to. However, not everybody has a choice, and in some of the countries where they're suffering from traumas of war, and they have had to flee from those countries and move to another sort of country where they're seeking asylum, then they could very well be forced to migrate. So we end up with people that are in situations where they're classed as refugees. Now, these particular people may not have English as their second language. They may not speak English at all. They may not have access to understanding our legal frameworks or any of the visa requirements. All of these things need to be taken into consideration when we're looking at mental health, because we're not just looking at mental health issues for people, we're also looking at trauma-informed mental health issues. We're also looking at the fact that people have moved into a country where they have no idea about how to communicate with other people in that country, and the fear that they have brought with them. So before we even contemplate looking at mental health issues, there are a lot of other layers that we need to be able to get through before we address that. So something I think is a really valid point, that in the especially in the culture that we live in today, that if we are working in this environment, we need to be able to recognize that people don't necessarily speak our language, they don't necessarily understand our culture or the legal structure that is there for them. We simply know that every single person that lives in Australia has entitlement to our laws, but they don't. And it is sometimes a really difficult thing to put across, the freedom that Australians live under when they have had to flee the country that they have come from. to get to us. So I think we need to take some time often and be able to understand how to put that across. And yes, very often we're going to need a lot of support and a lot of interpreters even to be able to do that. So again, giving you that little bit of understanding about the history behind mental health. Throughout the 12 weeks, I'm going to show you some historical pictures. Some of them you might find quite alarming, and some of them you might just be interested with them. And some of the things that they actually did in the early 18th century, which can actually come across to us as being, whoa, that's quite horrifying. We're still using some of these methods in today's world, only we've moved quite a way of trying to manage to get them more up-to-date, more ethical practices of using them. However, let's have a little look at some of them just to get a better idea. A lot of the treatments that we did use back in the 18th century were classed as definitely not being humane and definitely not in the moral area that we work in today. But innovation and exnovation and the development of some of these technologies and strategies for empirical testing of treatments. Some of the treatments for neurological disease, so when we look at neurological disease, the ones historically were from syphilis. So if you are unaware of what syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease, which we still have that in the societies that we live in today. It's just not very prevalent, so it's not heard of very well, and it is also normally caught early and controlled by a drug. But syphilis impacts the brain, and so does epilepsy. So this is why they've kind of like linked these two together. And there was a lot of uncontrolled work around that when people first started to have like fits, which syphilis and people with epilepsy almost seem to be doing the same thing because of the way that syphilis impacted the brain. So we started to move into what we called the Salveson treatments, and this was put together to try and support and help for seizures. And this came from Germany in the early 1900s. So the physical treatments and the better drugs around this actually were built between the early 1900s through to the 1950s. And some of them were really put together well during World War II. So the first effective antipsychotic medication, which was chlorpromazine, was developed in 1952 in France, and this was an antidepressant, and this had like an antidepressant effect, and it was from something called imipramine, which was reported in 1957. So just building on a little bit of history here. If you want to dig around in some more and get a more knowledgeable understanding of this, please go and look into your prescribed text, all right, because it's all in there. However, where I want to get to here is to tell you that the beginnings of the imipramine, which was reported in 1957, actually came back to introducing the tricyclic antidepressants in the same year. Out came benzodiazepine tranquilizers, which was synthesized. Now, the tricyclic antidepressants, if you are aware of anybody that has ever taken antidepressants, or you may yourself have taken antidepressants, if you look at the name or the title of them, the tricyclics are still used regularly and given through a prescription from a GP today. They may not be called tricyclic, but if they end in cyclic, they come from that particular family. And I think also we're all very, very aware of the benzodiazepine tranquilizers as well. So I know that I'm going a little bit backwards and a little bit forwards, but it'll all make sense come the end. ECT, which was your electroconvulsive therapy. This was developed quite early in 1938 by Italians, and it was very, very first used for schizophrenia, but most effective in people with severe depression. So I've managed to go and get some historical pictures around this, so as you can see what it looked like back in the early 1930s. And ECT treatment is still being used today. Obviously, there's a lot more knowledge around that and much more knowledgeable therapies, but it's still got that base value of being electroconvulsive therapy. Psychological treatment, so progressed in efficacy through the late 20th century as the behavioural and cognitive revolutions brought new treatments into play. So remember, most of the things that we've talked about, and even if we go back to what we way back when we talked about Pavlov and Skinner earlier in this presentation, this is all about behaviour and it's all about cognition. What we do and what we think, how does our brain work and how does that generate our behaviour? So the two absolutely go together. Some of the best ways to respond to the problems posed by mental illness was to actively participate in the allied health services providers, which the allied health service providers are still what we use and work with today. There are the service users and carers, and the move towards deinstitutionalization. This is one of the most important things which impacts the way that we work with mental health today. So moving from deinstitutionalization into community care, this changed mental health hugely. Because before anybody with a mental health issue, they were literally locked away in an institution where all of the institutions were away from like the social society. So they were not on common ground. They were in isolation. And when people were put into an institution, they very rarely ever came out. And they were heavily drugged and sedated. And people like Skinner, Pavlov, definitely Freud, they did a lot of work in these institutions on the people that were in them to be able to understand what mental health actually was and how we could work with people to change what it was that we were living with then. So on one hand, when we reflect back, the models that they used were definitely what we would class in today's world as unethical. However, what they did led us to where we are now, and it also led to deinstitutionalization. By bringing people out of the institutes and bringing them into our community, initially all that did was generate a lot of fear. But we're getting over that fear and being able to understand that people with a mental health issue have a requirement to be treated, and they have the same respect really that we ask for, and to be able to live in the society that they were born into, They just need to be, they just need some more support and potentially some medical help as well. So there was a lot of consumer perspectives that enabled deinstitutionalization, because the picture that's on here, this is what happened to people that were in institutes. They were drugged, they just sat around, they didn't do very much. Most of them, and you'll see more pictures throughout the next 12 weeks, the way that some of the treatments in institutions and what it was like, where people they were just tied up, and the reality is once they were in an institution, they were probably there until they died, and they had no life. This is what their life actually looked like. So speaking out, we need to be able to speak out about behaviour like this, their needs, abuses, rights, and it's an opposition to inhumane strategies and treatments. What I'm going to say is, thank God we live in the world that we live in today, and we do not live like that 100 years ago. So disempowerment is a failure of recognition because of his or her diagnosis resulting in dehumanization of a person. A lot of that comes from fear and the unknown. The social production of power through the processes of human interaction, where an individual may feel useful or unworthy, lacking confidence, dominant or subordinate in each and every relationship in which he or she is involved. So it's the difference between taking away everybody's day-to-day events. It really is dehumanizing somebody, because we don't understand how to work with somebody. By changing that, changes everything. Power and mental health and self-advocacy and empowerment, those are the areas where we tend to work nowadays. It is a strength-based world that we live in within the mental health sector. It is looking at people's what people have that is their strength. How can we work with what they've got that they can work with to strengthen them further, and also to be what are their needs to be able to move forward, to be able to have a life rather than be drugged up and left in an institution. From an institution to deinstitutionalization, to getting an understanding of what mental health actually is, led to recovery. And what was recovery? And that took time. That took time to be able to get an idea of how do we look after people. We've spent all that time locking people away. Now we've got an understanding of what it is they're presenting issues, and how do we work with that? What do we do about that? So the origins of the notion in the mental health field can be traced to at least 3 key influences. So it was self-help movements, which was regaining sobriety and restoring one's life, which originated in the addiction field. So hopefully most of you have done SPS301, which is an alcohol and other drugs unit. So you would be very familiar with addictions and how it impacts, and how the brain impacts with, again, the behavior. So we've gone back to that behavior cognition. How does the brain work? The brain works with addiction. Addiction becomes the behavior. So if it's something simple as being an alcoholic, your brain has that addictive behavior, so you behave in a certain way, so you drink. Without going too far down that pathway in this session, we need to be able to understand that by going to understanding an addiction, we can actually change the behavior. So that's a self-help movement. And then the consumer or survivor movement, where it's the human rights and the challenging of discrimination. Again, all of these things led to deinstitutionalization, because we're looking at if you put somebody in an institute, like the pictures that I showed you previous, where you just lock them away and you drug them up and let them walk around until they kind of like end their life and die, we're taking away all of their human rights. And that is discrimination. So, you know, we need to challenge that. And that has happened. So that challenge has led to deinstitutionalization and the awareness that we need to understand mental health, and we need to work with people with mental health issues because they have human rights too. And then you've got psychiatric rehabilitation, with its focus on restoring a functioning life and community reintegration. So removing people out of isolation, bringing them into society, understanding what we need to help people to live a better life. That is the focus on recovery. That is the world that I'm happy to say that we live in today. But I wanted you to also understand how far we've actually come, because we've come a long, long way to get to the society that we live in today. This is a handout on a focus of recovery. So this is actually embedded into Moodle. Please have a look at it because it will help you and support you through some of your assessments. I'm not going to spend the time to read this to you because it will probably make more sense if you spend some time reading it and putting it into context with what the things that we've talked about today. But please do have a look at it, because it's something that you will need to do. So with that in mind, week 1 of SPS 304, we have now got to the end of that session. I do hope that you have enjoyed it. I also hope that you've taken some questions away and that you bring them to our session next week. If you don't feel comfortable to bring them to the session next week, then that's okay. If you don't, send me an email. All right, stay in touch. Send me an email. That's what I'm here for. Now, before I end completely, I am just going to cover off a couple of things here, which I definitely will recap next week. So, assessments. You have the 4 assessments which you will need to do. Now, if any of you have been in any of my previous classes, you will know that I will step you through every single assessment prior to you doing them. And I will give you plenty of opportunity and plenty of chance. But some of the things that I wanted to talk to you about today is assessment 4, which is quite simply the tutorial assessment. So you all know that there's 10% that you can pick up for your tutorial and participation. However, you have to be in that tutorial and you have to participate. So for this particular course, there is a tutorial before the lecture and there will be a tutorial after the lecture. There is 10%. Because none of you were able to attend last week, please disregard that. That will not be taken into consideration with that grade. But moving forward into week 2, you have to attend the tutorial that you are enrolled into, and you also have to participate. And then, of course, the lecture will be central to that. That's the only thing I want to say about today with the tutorials. So just make sure you're there, make sure that you participate and enjoy it, because that's where you get that opportunity to put all of the knowledge and skill that you're learning into practice. And it's about having that opportunity to be able to work in smaller groups with the other students in the tutorial, as well as being able to have a voice and have a say, and for us to have that opportunity to really be able to open up discussions rather than it just being an extension of a lecture. because the lecture is very, very important, and I know that you have to sit and listen to that, but the tutorial is your turn to be able to engage. I think I've talked enough. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and I really look forward to seeing you next week. If you have any questions at all in the meantime, please send me an email. Stay safe, take care, and I will see you next Monday. Thank you, everybody, and I'll catch you later. Bye.